talk to you a little bit about the new book that Tharoor mentioned. Though he called it Inglorious Empire, which is the title of the British edition, I believe there are some copies of the Indian edition available. It's exactly the same book. In India, it's called An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. The British edition is called Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Each publisher knows, I suppose, what kind of title attracts readers in their own markets. But it's the same book, except that the Indian edition is lakhs and crores, and the British edition has billions and millions. Otherwise, there really is not much difference otherwise. So, just to say that I'm very pleased to see you all here. And what I'm planning with Tharoor is to give you a brief outline of the issues in the book. And then I'll be very happy to take your questions, either on what I've said about the book or what I've not said, on anything else that you may be interested in asking me. And I'm very happy to address you as long as time permits, and then I head straight to the airport and fly back to Delhi. So, as it already began saying, India was one of the richest countries in the world. In 1700, India had 27% of global GDP, which was the richest in the world. By 1800, it was down to 23%. The Chinese were slightly higher. But it was an incredibly prosperous country, as we know from the accounts of various travelers from the Middle East, from Europe and elsewhere, who traveled to various parts of India and recorded their impressions. So in 1700, for example, the revenues of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb exceeded those of all the crowned heads of Europe put together. So that included Louis in Versailles and the joint king and queen in the Buckingham Palace. All of them put together, their revenues were lower than those of the Mughal Emperor. So that's the kind of society we're talking about. Highly prosperous, highly successful, a sophisticated civilization of merchants, traders, artisans, warriors, jewelers, craftsmen, with a thriving industry, no record of landlessness or poverty, quite an astonishingly prosperous and successful place in the world. So that's why the British came there. And within a couple of hundred years of domination, rule, pillage and exploitation, they successfully reduced it to one of the poorest countries in the world, a poster child for poverty, disease and illiteracy. Now how they managed to do that is the subject of the book, but it's not the only. I will tell you briefly what the argument is. You will really have to read the book because it's fairly substantively packed, 300 odd pages. But half the book lays out the case and the other half addresses the counter case. The fact is that a number of apologists for the British Empire have been arguing that whatever the truth may be of what they did, that basically they were good for India because they created, as the British see it, democracy, political unity, rule of law. They gave us the railways, the English language, the law courts, etc. And shouldn't we be grateful? This is broadly the theme, and the somewhat more sophisticated version of this is from the recent very popular best-selling historians like Niall Ferguson and Lawrence James and Andrew Roberts, who are arguing that the British Empire in India is what laid the foundations for India to take advantage of the globalization of the 21st century. Of course, it's an argument they only started making after India became prosperous again, but not in the early days when they had still left us reeling from their depredations. Now, so I'm going to briefly address both halves of the argument. Obviously, I can't cover everything in the time we have, but I'll be happy to take your questions so that anything that particularly interests you I can come to. So the first half of the argument is about the economic destruction and loot of India, and it occupies about half the book. I talk about the way in which the British first came as a trading company. Initially, for 100 years, that's all they were. They were traders. They had so-called factories, not because they manufactured anything, but because the traders were called factors, and where the factors lived and worked was called a factory, and they had them in a number of port towns with the consent of the local Rajas or the Mughal Emperor himself. And they were basically trying to make money through trade. But in the early 18th century, a political vacuum The British admitted to 379 killed in 15 minutes. The Indians claimed it was over 1,000, but probably somewhere between the two numbers. A further 1,000 grievously injured, but worse was to follow. Dyer sealed the gate and would not let anybody attend to the dead, the dying, and the wounded for 24 hours a day in that hot April sun, baking, crying, wailing out, while their relatives could not even give them a drop of water. Dyer made Indians crawl on a street on their bellies, so that if they so much as lifted their head would be bashed in by British tapes, poked with their rail lines were ripped out of the ground and sent off to aid the war effort. The sum total of India's assistance to Britain in the First World War is measured in today's money at 80 billion pounds sterling. That's about $100 billion. So the British couldn't have fought the war without us. And at the end of it, of course, perfidious Albion broke its word, betrayed its promises, and not only did it not give responsible self-government, it actually reimposed the repressive wartime